History tells us that confession is meant to cleanse the soul, but what happens when the act of confession becomes a sentence of death? In the candlelit churches of colonial Maryland, where faith ruled every breath and silence was mistaken for obedience, there existed a family whose name was never spoken aloud after sundown. They were priests, they were trusted, and they were listening. Tonight we descend into a forgotten religious nightmare, one where whispered sins became currency, absolution became leverage, and salvation was only granted to those who could afford it. This is the macabre history of the Thornton family, a sinister tale buried beneath centuries of prayer. When the Thornton family first set foot on the damp red-brown soil of colonial Maryland, they did not arrive as conquerors or criminals, but as men cloaked in righteousness, carrying scripture instead of steel and sermons instead of threats, and that was precisely why no one feared them. Father Thomas Thornton was already known by reputation before his boots touched the docks, spoken of in hushed reverence as a man of rare discipline, a priest whose voice could still a restless congregation and whose gaze made even hardened sinners feel suddenly, inexplicably exposed. He traveled with his two nephews, Edmund and Silas, young men shaped from the same severe mold, their eyes always lowered in humility, their mouths careful with words, their devotion rehearsed so convincingly that even seasoned clergy welcomed them without suspicion. Maryland in those years was a land obsessed with salvation, where faith was not merely belief but survival, where eternal damnation loomed larger than hunger or disease, and the Thorntons understood this landscape immediately, the way a predator understands terrain. They did not rush to power, they waited. They preached softly at first, sermons filled with mercy and redemption, speaking of confession as a sacred refuge, a place where no sin was too dark to be forgiven if surrendered fully and truthfully. The people listened, they always did, because fear of God was already woven into their bones, and the Thorntons knew that fear, once acknowledged, could be shaped into obedience. Within months, parishioners lined up outside the confessionals, eager to unburden themselves before a priest who seemed to listen not just with his ears, but with his soul. And behind the thin wooden walls of those booths, secrets began to spill, affairs hidden behind respectable marriages, stolen land quietly justified as providence, thoughts of violence never acted upon but deeply fantasized, confessions whispered with trembling lips by men and women who believed that once spoken aloud, their sins would dissolve into grace. But the Thorntons did not treat these confessions as fleeting words meant only for God. They remembered them, all of them. Father Thomas trained his nephews carefully, teaching them that listening was not a passive act but an active discipline, that every pause, every hesitation, every repeated sin revealed more than the words themselves ever could. Edmund learned to recognize desperation, Silas learned to recognize ambition, and Thomas learned to recognize weakness in all its forms. Soon the confessionals were no longer places of release but of extraction, where guilt was drawn out slowly, carefully, like poison from a wound, and stored away where it could be studied. The church expanded under their guidance, its influence stretching beyond prayer into trade, politics, and private life, because people trusted the Thorntons in a way they trusted no one else, not even their own families. A man who had confessed murder could walk free in public, knowing that the only souls who knew his truth wore clerical collars and spoke of mercy. A woman who admitted adultery could continue her life untouched by scandal, certain that her shame was sealed behind holy walls, and that certainty was the Thorntons' greatest weapon. They spoke often of silence, as a virtue, of obedience as love, of the danger of questioning God's chosen servants, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the congregation learned that survival meant compliance. Those who confessed frequently were praised for humility, those who hesitated were gently reminded of the spiritual consequences of withholding truth. Over time, confession became less about repentance and more about reassurance that the church still protected you, still remembered you, still held your secret safely. And yet, Beneath that reassurance lay an unspoken understanding that protection could be withdrawn just as easily as it had been given. The Thorntons never threatened openly. They did not need to. A raised eyebrow during Mass, a sermon that felt uncomfortably specific, a sudden private summons to the rectory, these were enough to remind even the most powerful parishioner of where true authority resided. Donations increased, favors were granted, laws bent quietly, and when rumors began to circulate of certain men falling ill after communion, of sudden deaths blamed on God's mysterious will, the Thorntons spoke of faith being tested, of the righteous being called home, of the dangers of gossip poisoning the soul. The people accepted these explanations because the alternative, believing that their spiritual guardians were something else entirely, was unthinkable. By the time anyone realized that the church no longer merely guided their lives but owned them, it was already too late, because the Thorntons had not just built a congregation, they had built a system, one that fed on confession, thrived on secrecy, and grew stronger with every whispered sin. And as this dark foundation settled into the heart of Maryland, unseen and unquestioned, the Thornton family stood at its center, patient and watchful, knowing that true power does not announce itself, it listens, remembers, and waits. As the months turned into years and the Thorntons' influence seeped deeper into the marrow of the colony, the confessional ceased to be merely a place of whispered absolution and became instead a quiet engine of control, humming beneath the rituals of faith. Because Father Thomas had come to understand something essential about power in a devout society, people fear exposure more than punishment, and they will surrender almost anything to keep their sins unseen. The wooden booths were modified subtly at first, changes so small that no parishioner could have named them, even if they sensed something was different. The panels slightly thicker, the latticework tighter, the walls reinforced under the guise of craftsmanship and durability, and behind those walls Edmund and Silas worked with a patience that bordered on reverence, learning how to preserve voices, how to mark names, dates, and transgressions, how to turn memory into archive. Confessions were catalogued not in ink but in ritual, in repeated phrases, in coded gestures exchanged between uncle and nephews after Mass, so that nothing written could ever be discovered. Because discovery was not the risk the Thorntons feared, they feared only interruption. Each night, long after candles burned low and the church stood empty, they met in the sacristy to reconstruct the day's offerings, speaking softly of merchants who cheated their partners, magistrates who accepted bribes, husbands who beat their wives behind closed doors, wives who prayed for their husbands' deaths, young men who fantasized about violence, and elders who had stolen land from neighbors and justified it as divine reward. No secret was dismissed as trivial, because Father Thomas believed that even the smallest shame could become a lever if pressed at the right moment, and so the collection grew, invisible but immense, a shadow archive of human frailty that extended into every respectable household in Maryland. The Thorntons did not act on these secrets immediately. Haste, Thomas warned, was the enemy of longevity, and so they waited, allowing their reputations to harden into something untouchable, something that made accusations seem absurd before they were ever spoken. They cultivated allies carefully, never demanding loyalty outright but offering guidance, spiritual counsel, and quiet assistance when problems arose. And when a man found his legal troubles vanishing after a discreet meeting with Father Thomas, or a widow received unexpected protection from creditors after confessing her desperation, the lesson embedded itself deeply. Obedience brought safety. Gradually, requests began to flow toward the rectory, always framed as spiritual concerns but carrying unmistakable worldly implications. Favors asked, rivalries softened, investigations redirected, votes influenced, all accomplished without overt command. Because the Thorntons understood that the most effective coercion feels like choice, and when resistance appeared, as it inevitably did, it was met not with violence but with precision, because Father Thomas believed that fear should be personalized, tailored to the soul of its recipient. A respected landowner who began to question church finances found himself confronted privately with the intimate details of his own confessions, repeated back to him with unsettling accuracy, his moral authority collapsing in a single silent moment. A merchant who refused to donate was reminded gently of the testimony he had once offered regarding fraudulent weights and measures, and his refusal dissolved into compliance without a word spoken beyond prayer. Even those who sensed the danger dared not speak, because to accuse the Thorntons was to admit one's own guilt, and the colony had been conditioned to believe that guilt spoken aloud to anyone but a priest was a path to ruin. Rituals of communion grew more elaborate, the wine imported at greater expense, blessed with solemnity and consumed with trust, and when illness followed certain chalices, it was explained as God's judgment, as spiritual weakness manifesting physically, as the body rejecting grace it did not deserve. Deaths were mourned but never investigated, because who would suspect poison in a sacrament administered by men believed to stand closest to God? The Thorntons did not kill often, only when necessary, only when a secret threatened to escape their grasp, and each death reinforced the silence of the living, teaching the congregation that defiance did not end in spectacle but in quiet disappearance. Over time, the church became the axis around which all authority turned. Its priests consulted before business deals were sealed, marriages arranged, disputes settled, and the line between spiritual guidance and governance blurred until it vanished entirely, leaving behind a structure that looked like faith but functioned like a syndicate. Father Thomas preached humility while shaping destinies, preached forgiveness while compiling leverage, preached obedience while standing above the law, and Edmund and Silas watched and learned, perfecting their roles as listeners, archivists, and enforcers, understanding that the confessional had become a mirror in which the colony saw its own corruption reflected and could not bear to look away. And yet, beneath this carefully maintained order, a fracture had begun to form, small and almost invisible, born not of rebellion but of curiosity, because there are always those who listen more closely than intended, those who notice patterns others accept as coincidence, and somewhere among the faithful, someone had begun to wonder why certain names were spoken with reverence even after their owners had vanished, why some sins were forgiven and others were never mentioned again, and why the Church's silence felt less like mercy and more like surveillance, a question that lingered unanswered, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. The question that had begun as a faint discomfort soon found its shape in the mind of a young woman named Eleanor Combe, though at first she did not recognize it as rebellion or even doubt, only as an unease she could not pray away, because Eleanor had been raised to trust the Church with a devotion so complete it bordered on instinct, yet she possessed the dangerous habit of noticing details others dismissed as God's will, and it was she who first connected the silences that followed certain deaths, the careful way Father Thomas's sermons shifted after private meetings with influential families, the unnatural calm with which tragedy was absorbed and forgotten whenever it brushed too close to the rectory. Eleanor's family occupied a narrow but respected rung of colonial society, prosperous enough to be visible yet vulnerable enough to be crushed by scandal, and like everyone else, they knelt weakly in the same pew, confessing faithfully, believing sincerely that salvation required transparency before God's chosen intermediaries. But Eleanor had lost an older brother the previous winter, a sudden illness that followed communion at a special mass, held to celebrate a land acquisition that had angered several smaller farmers, and while grief had consumed her parents, Eleanor had lingered on the details, remembering the faint bitterness her brother mentioned after drinking the wine, the way Father Thomas had clasped his shoulder afterward, with something like relief rather than concern, and the speed with which the death had been attributed to divine mystery rather than examined. She began to listen more closely during services, to watch who entered the confessional and who emerged pale and shaken, who was later elevated in status and who quietly receded from public life, and what disturbed her most was not the presence of sin, but the consistency of its management, as though an unseen hand guided consequences with meticulous care. Eleanor volunteered for church duties to remain close without appearing curious, cleaning linens, arranging candles, copying hymns, and it was during one such evening, alone in the nave as twilight bled through stained glass, that she heard voices behind the confessional wall, not the murmur of prayer, but measured discussion, names spoken without reverence, sins repeated without remorse, and a phrase that lodged itself in her mind like a splinter: "He will not be a problem again." She froze, heart hammering, because the voice belonged to Edmund Thornton, and the tone was not pastoral but administrative, the tone of a man closing an account. Eleanor retreated silently, fear eclipsing curiosity, yet from that moment on, the church no longer felt like sanctuary. It felt like a machine whose gears she had glimpsed by accident, and once seen, they could not be unseen. She began to test her suspicions cautiously, asking gentle questions of widows whose husbands had died unexpectedly, of merchants whose fortunes had reversed after confessions, of servants who had overheard things they did not understand but felt compelled to forget, and while no one would speak openly, patterns emerged in fragments, half-statements, and sudden silences, enough to convince Eleanor that the Thorntons' power rested not in God but in knowledge, weaponized through ritual. Still, suspicion alone could not challenge men so entrenched, and Eleanor knew that confronting them openly would be suicidal, not because they would strike her down publicly, but because they would turn her own secrets against her, because everyone had secrets, and the Thorntons knew how to make them lethal. The opportunity to move beyond suspicion came unexpectedly when Eleanor was summoned to assist during a private confession for a visiting cleric from Baltimore, a man rumored to be investigating irregularities in colonial churches, though his presence was explained as fraternal visitation. She was instructed to prepare the confessional early and wait nearby, and as she worked, she noticed a loose panel near the base, a flaw she could not recall seeing before, and when curiosity overpowered caution, she pressed gently, feeling the hollow space behind it. The faint vibration of sound carried through hidden channels. Her breath caught as understanding crystallized. The confessional was not merely overheard, it was engineered to capture, to preserve, to remember. The visiting cleric never completed his confession. He fell ill that night and departed abruptly the next morning, his inquiries abandoned, and Eleanor understood then that the Thorntons' reach extended even beyond the colony, that they had anticipated scrutiny and prepared contingencies. Fear threatened to paralyze her, yet grief hardened her resolve, because her brother's death now felt less like tragedy and more like collateral damage, and Eleanor could not reconcile her faith with silence. She began to write, not accusations but observations, recording dates, names, sermons, deaths, donations, and subtle shifts in influence, hiding the pages beneath loose floorboards, knowing that documentation was both her weapon and her death warrant. The more she learned, the clearer the structure became: secrets harvested through confession, leverage applied through blackmail, resistance eliminated through poison administered as sacrament, all wrapped in the language of salvation so convincingly that victims blamed themselves even as they died. Eleanor also came to understand that Father Thomas was not alone in this design, that Edmund and Silas had refined it beyond their uncle's original vision, turning spiritual authority into a network of control that spanned courts, markets, and households, making the church indispensable not just for souls, but for survival. Yet even as the enormity of the conspiracy unfolded, Eleanor faced a more intimate terror, because she too had confessed, had entrusted her own vulnerabilities to the same system she now sought to expose, and she knew that the moment the Thorntons sensed her awareness, they would act, not necessarily with poison but with revelation, stripping her of credibility, family, and safety. She weighed the cost carefully, understanding that truth in such a world did not liberate, it annihilated, but to remain silent was to accept complicity, and Eleanor had reached the point where faith without conscience felt like blasphemy. The first crack in the Thorntons' armor came not from confrontation but from absence. When Silas missed a meeting, then another, his movements suddenly erratic, his confidence fraying because even predators grow careless when they believe themselves untouchable, and Eleanor sensed that the empire built on secrecy was beginning to strain under its own weight, unaware that a single witness, patient and unyielding, was preparing to drag it into the light, not with righteous fury but with methodical truth, the kind that corrodes lies from the inside until they collapse under the burden of their own contradictions. By the time Eleanor realized the smallest disturbance could unravel even the most carefully fortified power, the air around the Thornton rectory had changed in a way she could feel in her bones, a pressure like a storm building just beyond the horizon because Silas's absences were no longer merely noticed but whispered about, and whispers were dangerous things in a colony trained to speak only in sanctioned tones. The brothers attempted to mask the disruption with louder sermons and more frequent rituals, flooding the community with reassurance, but Eleanor recognized the tactic for what it was, noise designed to drown out doubt. She watched as Edmund took on more public duties, his voice resonant with confidence that bordered on strain, and as Father Thomas grew increasingly secluded, emerging only for Mass and confession, his eyes dull with a fatigue that prayer could no longer disguise. It was during this period of imbalance that Eleanor's careful documentation evolved from passive observation into deliberate strategy, because she understood now that truth alone was insufficient. It required timing, witnesses, and a mechanism to survive contact with power. She began to cultivate relationships quietly, not with the elite whose secrets fed the Thorntons' machine, but with those marginalized enough to be overlooked, yet numerous enough to matter: widows, servants, itinerant workers, small farmers displaced by sudden legal decisions whose origins traced back to confessional whispers. With each conversation, Eleanor offered nothing but empathy, allowing others to speak first, to frame their losses in their own words, and she discovered that shared suffering loosened tongues more effectively than accusation ever could. Stories aligned with her records, reinforcing patterns she had feared were coincidence, and in those moments, Eleanor felt the terrifying clarity of standing at the edge of something vast, knowing that stepping forward would mean never stepping back. The danger escalated when a child fell ill after communion, not dying but lingering, and the family's refusal to accept divine explanation created a ripple of unease the Thorntons could not immediately suppress, because illness without death invited questions, and questions demanded answers that poison could not easily erase. Eleanor attended the child during her recovery, offering comfort while listening as the mother recounted a confession she now regretted, one involving knowledge of land deeds and falsified records, and Eleanor felt a chill as she realized how close the family had come to elimination. The child survived, and survival itself became an accusation, a reminder that the system was not infallible, and Edmund's response was swift but clumsy, attempting to redirect attention through charity and spectacle, hosting feasts and public prayers that felt less like devotion and more like defense. Eleanor sensed an opportunity and took a risk she had long avoided, revealing fragments of her knowledge to a man named Caleb Rowe, a former clerk dismissed years earlier after a sudden fall from favor that followed a private confession, whose bitterness had hardened into caution rather than despair. She did not present herself as an accuser but as a listener, sharing just enough to confirm that his experience was not isolated, and in doing so, she gained an ally whose understanding of records and law complemented her own observations. Together, they began to trace the Thorntons' influence beyond the church, mapping how decisions made in confession booths manifested as court rulings, marriages, business failures, and conveniently timed deaths, and the map they created was as damning as it was fragile, because possession of such knowledge made them targets. The tension reached a breaking point when Silas reappeared unexpectedly, thinner, restless, his eyes darting with a paranoia that suggested he had glimpsed consequences he could no longer outrun, and Eleanor understood that something had gone wrong beyond her sight, perhaps a failed poisoning, a secret that had escaped containment, or a conscience he had not anticipated. His return triggered a tightening of control, with confessions conducted behind locked doors and communion administered only by Father Thomas himself, and Eleanor knew that escalation meant desperation, which in turn meant mistakes. She positioned herself carefully, present enough to observe but distant enough to avoid suspicion, and it was during a late-night vigil following a sudden death that she overheard an argument between Edmund and Silas, their voices sharp with blame, revealing fractures Eleanor had not dared hope for, because power shared is power contested, and the brothers' unity had always been their greatest strength. The argument hinted at a missing ledger, something Silas had hidden or lost during his absence, and Eleanor felt a surge of grim satisfaction, because records were the Thorntons' lifeblood, and without them, their threats lost precision. Determined to find this ledger before it resurfaced, Eleanor followed Silas discreetly one evening as he slipped from the rectory into the woods beyond the church grounds, her heart pounding with each step, knowing that discovery would mean death without ceremony. She watched as he reached a shallow ravine and retrieved a small chest buried beneath loose stones, his hands shaking as he opened it. And in that moment, Eleanor saw not a monster, but a man unraveling under the weight of his own crimes, whispering prayers that sounded more like bargaining than repentance. She did not intervene, understanding that confrontation would alert him to her presence. But the knowledge of the chest's existence shifted the balance irrevocably, because now the conspiracy had a physical heart that could be seized, exposed, or destroyed. As Eleanor retreated, she felt the precariousness of her position acutely, aware that each step forward narrowed her chances of survival. Yet she also felt a resolve sharpened by proximity to truth, because the Thorntons' empire, once vast and immovable, now appeared brittle, sustained by fear and secrecy that could not withstand sustained light. The colony itself seemed to sense the shift, conversations lingering longer, prayers sounding less certain, as though faith itself were holding its breath. And Eleanor knew that the coming reckoning would not be clean or just, that innocence would suffer alongside guilt, but she also knew that silence had already exacted its toll, and that whatever followed would be shaped not only by the Thorntons' sins, but by the courage of those willing to remember, to speak, and to endure the consequences of refusing to look away. The days that followed Eleanor's discovery of the hidden chest, time itself seemed to stretch and warp around her, each hour heavy with consequence, because knowing where the heart of the Thornton conspiracy lay did not grant her power so much as it burdened her with responsibility, and she moved through the rectory and the surrounding parish with the measured caution of someone carrying a lit candle through a powder magazine, aware that a single careless breath could ignite everything. She resisted the urge to act immediately, understanding that haste was the ally of fear, and instead focused on observing the subtle changes that rippled outward from Silas's growing instability, changes that confirmed her suspicion that the brothers no longer trusted one another fully. Edmund grew sharper in his sermons, his words laced with warnings about betrayal and false witnesses, while Father Thomas retreated even further into ritual, performing Mass with mechanical precision as though repetition itself could restore control. Parishioners noticed, of course, because communities always do, and Eleanor sensed the beginnings of a dangerous curiosity taking root among them, curiosity that could either blossom into resistance or be crushed into obedience depending on who guided it first. She began quietly reinforcing that curiosity, not by accusing the Thorntons outright, but by asking questions framed as concern, wondering aloud why certain families had suffered such misfortune after seeking spiritual guidance, why others seemed mysteriously protected despite obvious moral failings, and in doing so she allowed doubt to germinate without revealing its source. Meanwhile, Caleb worked in parallel, using his familiarity with colonial records to identify discrepancies that aligned with Eleanor's observations, discovering altered dates, missing signatures, and sudden transfers of property that traced an invisible line back to the confessional booth, and each discovery added weight to the invisible structure they were preparing to reveal. The pressure intensified when news arrived that a magistrate from Annapolis would be visiting the parish to review a land dispute, a routine matter on the surface, but one that threatened to expose the Thorntons' influence to outside scrutiny, and Eleanor saw the brothers' reactions diverge. In telling ways, Edmund immediately sought to charm and distract, proposing lavish hospitality, while Silas panicked, urging preemptive measures that Eleanor suspected involved poison. Father Thomas hesitated, caught between them, and that hesitation was new, a crack in the foundation that Eleanor recognized as her narrow window. She maneuvered herself into proximity during the preparations for the magistrate's visit, offering assistance that could not be refused without appearing suspicious, and in those moments she watched Silas closely, noting how his hands trembled when handling the communion wine, how his eyes flicked toward Eleanor with an intensity that suggested either suspicion or fear, perhaps both. One evening, as dusk settled and the church emptied, Eleanor felt the unmistakable sensation of being followed, a weight at her back that sharpened her senses, and she forced herself to continue calmly until she reached the edge of the graveyard, where Silas confronted her under the pretense of concern, his voice low and strained as he asked what she had been doing so late in the rectory. Eleanor met his gaze steadily, answering truthfully but incompletely, a skill she had honed through months of careful survival, and she watched as his suspicion warred with uncertainty, because accusing her outright would require acknowledging the fragility of their secrecy. The encounter confirmed her fears that Silas was unraveling faster than the others, and she resolved that if the chest were to be secured, it would have to be done before desperation drove him to destroy or relocate it. That opportunity came sooner than expected when a violent storm swept through the colony, lashing the countryside with rain and wind so fierce that even the Thorntons withdrew indoors, trusting that no one would venture out in such conditions, and Eleanor seized the moment with a resolve born of knowing that waiting carried its own fatal risks. Under cover of darkness and thunder, she made her way to the ravine, her clothes soaked and her breath ragged as she located the disturbed stones by memory and feel, her hands shaking not from cold, but from the enormity of what she was about to do. The chest was heavier than she anticipated, its weight a physical manifestation of the secrets it contained, and as she pried it open just enough to confirm its contents, ledgers, coded notes, correspondence bearing seals of prominent families, she felt both vindication and dread, because proof did not guarantee justice, only conflict. She concealed the chest temporarily in a hollow beneath a fallen tree, marking the location in her mind, knowing she could not yet move it without attracting attention, and as she returned, soaked and exhausted, she realized that the storm had not merely masked her actions, but mirrored the chaos now inevitable within the Thornton Empire. The following morning, Silas's agitation was unmistakable, his movements frantic, his temper volatile, and Eleanor observed from the periphery as he argued with Edmund in whispers that carried sharp edges, their disagreement culminating in Silas storming out toward the woods, only to return hours later pale and shaken, his eyes darting as though expecting the ground itself to accuse him. Eleanor understood then that he had discovered the chest's absence, or at least suspected it, and that the balance had tipped irrevocably. Father Thomas called for extended prayer and fasting, a transparent attempt to reassert spiritual authority, but the gesture rang hollow to those already uneasy, and Eleanor sensed that the community was teetering on the brink of awareness. She confided the chest's existence to Caleb that night, not its location but its contents, and together they debated their next move, recognizing that revealing everything at once could provoke swift and violent suppression, while delay risked losing their advantage as the brothers tightened their grip. They decided on a gradual exposure, beginning with the magistrate's visit, using select documents to raise questions that could not be easily dismissed, and Eleanor prepared herself mentally for the role she would play, knowing that once she spoke, there would be no retreat into anonymity. As the magistrate arrived, greeted with forced warmth and carefully staged piety, Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her, the calm of someone who has already accepted the cost of action, and she watched as the Thorntons performed their roles with increasing strain, their confidence brittle, their unity fraying under the weight of secrets too heavy to carry alone. When the first question was asked, a seemingly innocuous inquiry about a disputed boundary, Eleanor saw Edmund's practiced smile falter just long enough to confirm that the unraveling had begun, and in that fleeting moment she understood that history was no longer something that happened to people like her, but something she was actively shaping, even if the final outcome remained uncertain, because the truth, once set in motion, had a momentum of its own, and whatever followed would be born not only of the Thorntons' crimes, but of the courage it took to pull those buried sins into the open, regardless of the darkness that might answer in return. By the time the magistrate's inquiry deepened beyond polite formalities, the atmosphere in the parish had grown so tense that even the most devout congregants sensed that something fundamental was shifting beneath their feet, and Eleanor felt it in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, not with suspicion toward her but with a quiet expectation, as if people instinctively knew she stood closer to the center of the storm than anyone else. The first day of hearings unfolded slowly, deliberately, with land records spread across a long oak table in the vestry, candles burning low despite the midday light, and Father Thomas hovering nearby under the guise of spiritual counsel while clearly listening to every word. Eleanor watched him carefully, noting how his hands folded and unfolded, how his lips moved silently in prayer or calculation, and she understood that he was weighing whether the force of his reputation could still bend the truth back into compliance. Edmund, ever the diplomat, took charge of answering questions, his voice smooth and reassuring as he explained away inconsistencies as clerical errors or misunderstandings common in a growing colony, and for a moment Eleanor worried that the carefully laid trap would collapse under the weight of his charisma. But then the magistrate asked for original copies rather than summaries, and the room fell into a silence so thick it seemed to press against Eleanor's ears, because original documents meant confronting the gaps Caleb had identified, the missing signatures and altered dates that no amount of eloquence could fully erase. When those documents were produced, their flaws were subtle but undeniable, and Eleanor saw the magistrate's expression shift from polite interest to professional concern, a small but crucial turn that signaled the beginning of real scrutiny. Over the next several days, that scrutiny widened, drawing in testimony from local surveyors, merchants, and even a widow whose late husband's property had inexplicably changed hands after a private confession years earlier, and Eleanor felt a strange mix of dread and relief as each voice added weight to the narrative she had carried alone for so long. The Thorntons responded by tightening their control over the parish, increasing sermons about obedience and divine order, but the effect backfired because fear, once named, loses its power to remain invisible, and people began to whisper openly about patterns they had once dismissed as coincidence. Silas grew increasingly erratic, alternating between long absences and bursts of furious activity, and Eleanor suspected he was attempting to relocate or destroy remaining evidence, unaware that the most damning NG records were already beyond his reach. One evening, as Eleanor returned from a quiet meeting with Caleb and the widow, she found a crude warning carved into the wooden post near her door, a symbol she recognized from the coded margins of the Thornton ledgers, a mark that meant silence enforced by death, and although her pulse quickened, she felt no urge to retreat, only a sharper clarity about the stakes she had already accepted. The following morning, the magistrate requested private interviews with several parish members, including Eleanor, and as she sat across from him in a small, sunlit room, she chose her words with care, offering facts rather than accusations, observations rather than conclusions, allowing the evidence to speak through her rather than positioning herself as its sole interpreter. She described the patterns of misfortune, the confessions followed by ruin, the unexplained deaths cloaked in piety, and she watched as the magistrate took notes with increasing intensity, occasionally pausing to ask questions that revealed he was connecting threads Eleanor had not even voiced aloud. Outside that room, the Thorntons sensed the shift, and Edmund confronted Eleanor in the courtyard afterward, his tone still civil but edged with desperation, asking why she was doing this, why she would risk the stability of the entire community for grievances that could never be fully proven. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching and replied that stability built on terror was not stability at all, and in that moment she saw something flicker behind his eyes, not remorse but fear of exposure, fear of losing the power that had defined his identity, and she realized that whatever humanity he might once have possessed had long since been subordinated to the machinery of control. The situation escalated when Silas was discovered attempting to flee the parish under cover of night, his belongings hastily packed, his demeanor frantic, and his capture by local constables transformed whispered suspicion into undeniable crisis, because flight, more than any document, implied guilt in a way no sermon could counter. Under questioning, Silas unraveled completely, his testimony a tangled mixture of half-truths, accusations against his brothers, and desperate justifications that revealed the extent of the conspiracy even as he tried to deflect blame, and Eleanor listened from the back of the crowded room as names spilled from his mouth like poison, names of families who had paid for silence, names of victims whose deaths had been carefully orchestrated to appear natural or divinely ordained. The parish erupted in chaos as those named protested, denied, or fled, and the Thorntons' once unassailable authority collapsed into confusion and anger, with Father Thomas retreating into seclusion and Edmund attempting one last appeal to ecclesiastical privilege that the magistrate, now fully convinced, refused to honor. As arrests were made and records seized, Eleanor felt a heavy weariness settle over her, not triumph but the exhaustion that follows prolonged vigilance, and she wondered briefly whether the truth, once revealed, could ever truly heal the damage it exposed. In the days that followed, the parish became a place of reckoning, with families forced to confront their complicity, victims' relatives demanding answers long denied, and the church itself stripped of the illusion that sanctity alone could absolve institutional evil. Eleanor withdrew from the center of events, allowing others to speak and grieve, but she remained present, a quiet witness to the unraveling she had helped set in motion, and she found solace in small acts of restoration, helping return property to rightful heirs, assisting the widow in reclaiming her home, and ensuring that the records, now in the magistrate's custody, would be preserved rather than quietly buried once more. Yet even as justice began its slow, imperfect work, Eleanor understood that the consequences LD not end with arrests or trials, because power structures rarely disappear without leaving scars, and she sensed that resentment, denial, and attempts at revision would follow, threatening to distort the narrative in favor of those who had benefited most. Late one night, as she stood alone in the church, now eerily quiet without the Thorntons' presence, Eleanor reflected on the cost of bringing darkness into the light, recognizing that while the truth had broken the immediate cycle of terror, it had also shattered illusions that many had relied upon for comfort, and she accepted that such loss was unavoidable. When she finally left the parish weeks later, her departure was unceremonious, marked not by gratitude or condemnation, but by a collective uncertainty about how to move forward. And as she walked away, she carried with her the knowledge that history is shaped not only by those who wield power, but by those who refuse to accept the lies that power demands, even when the price of refusal is fear, isolation, and the burden of remembering what others would rather forget. In the months that followed Eleanor's departure, the parish entered a phase that could only be described as a slow, grinding aftermath, one where the noise of scandal faded but the deeper consequences continued to echo through every household. And it was during this period that the true reach of the Thornton family's corruption became fully visible, not as a single conspiracy now neatly dismantled, but as a network of habits, silences, and quiet accommodations that had shaped the community for an entire generation. Trials began in the provincial court, drawing spectators from neighboring counties who arrived less out of moral outrage than morbid curiosity, eager to witness the downfall of men who had once seemed untouchable, and yet what unfolded was not the dramatic reckoning many had imagined, but a procedural, often frustrating crawl through depositions, financial ledgers, and contradictory testimony, as lawyers trained in obfuscation worked tirelessly to dilute responsibility and reframe crimes as unfortunate misunderstandings born of an imperfect era. Father Thomas, aged suddenly by the strain of exposure, was declared too infirm to stand trial and retreated into a remote ecclesiastical residence where he would live quietly for several more years, offering prayers no one knew how to interpret, while Edmund faced charges that focused narrowly on fraud and conspiracy rather than murder, a limitation that enraged victims' families but reflected the legal reality that so many deaths had been disguised too well to meet the court's standard of proof. Silas, desperate to save himself, became the prosecution's primary witness, and his testimony, though invaluable, was erratic and self-serving, forcing the court to sift truth from exaggeration, while the public watched with growing unease as the narrative they had embraced began to fracture into uncomfortable shades of grey. As names continued to surface, it became clear that the Thorntons had not acted alone, but had relied on the cooperation of merchants, minor officials, and even rival clergy who had accepted favors or protection in exchange for silence, and this revelation spread a new kind of fear, because it suggested that removing the family did not automatically dismantle the system they had perfected. Properties returned to heirs only after lengthy disputes, fortunes dissolved slowly through legal fees rather than moral restitution, and some families quietly relocated, hoping distance would erode memory, while others doubled down on denial, insisting that the entire affair had been exaggerated by political rivals or hostile reformers. In the parish itself, the church stood nearly empty for months, its authority irreparably damaged, and when services eventually resumed under a new priest, attendance was marked by a stiff, cautious politeness, as if faith itself had become something fragile that might shatter her under too much scrutiny. Eleanor's name surfaced occasionally in testimony and correspondence, often spoken with a mixture of admiration and resentment, and while some credited her courage with initiating the collapse, others blamed her for destabilizing a social order that, however cruel, had provided predictability, a reaction that underscored how deeply fear had been mistaken for peace. Beyond the courtroom, the psychological toll became evident in quieter ways. Widows who could not reconcile their grief with the realization that their husbands' deaths had been orchestrated, children who learned that inheritances once framed as divine blessing were built on coercion, and former confidants of the Thorntons who struggled to redefine themselves without the shadow of that alliance. Records seized during the investigation were catalogued and stored in the provincial archive, but not without resistance, as influential voices argued for their destruction in the name of communal harmony, and it took sustained pressure from reform-minded officials to ensure their preservation, a decision that would later prove crucial in preventing the story from being quietly rewritten. Meanwhile, rumors persisted that fragments of the archive remained unaccounted for, hidden or destroyed by those who feared future exposure, and these whispers kept the community in a state of low-level anxiety, aware that the past might yet resurface in unexpected ways. Eleanor herself, though physically absent, remained an invisible presence in these developments, her actions having set in motion forces that could not easily be contained, and letters addressed to her arrived sporadically from former parishioners seeking absolution, clarification, or simply someone to witness their attempts at atonement. She responded rarely and briefly, understanding that healing could not be mediated from a distance, and that each person would have to confront their own role without her guidance, a restraint that some interpreted as coldness, but which stemmed from a hard-earned recognition of the limits of intervention. As years passed, the trials concluded with sentences that satisfied no one entirely. The Thorntons' name faded from polite conversation, and the parish gradually resumed a semblance of normalcy. Yet beneath that surface lay an unresolved tension, a collective awareness that the community's moral foundation had been compromised in ways that no legal outcome could fully repair. New leaders emerged, promising transparency and reform, but skepticism lingered, and vigilance became a shared, if unspoken, value, with people watching authority more closely than before, less willing to surrender judgment to reputation alone. In private moments, some acknowledged that the scandal had forced a necessary reckoning, stripping away comforting illusions and exposing the ease with which evil could cloak itself in ritual and respectability, while others mourned the loss of certainty, preferring the old lies to the discomfort of truth. By the time the events entered local law, retold in fragments and softened language, the narrative had already begun to shift, emphasizing the sensational elements while downplaying the everyday complicity that had allowed the conspiracy to flourish. And it was this gradual distortion that posed the greatest threat to the legacy of what had been revealed. Yet even as memory blurred, the surviving records stood as a stubborn counterweight, a reminder that the past had been documented by those brave enough to observe carefully and write honestly, and that while communities may attempt to forget, evidence endures, waiting for someone willing to read it. In this way, the parish moved forward not with closure, but with a permanent scar, one that shaped its identity long after the names involved lost their immediacy, and, as Eleanor would later reflect in a rare letter, the true measure of justice was not whether the guilty were punished, but whether few. Mature generations learned to recognize the early signs of corruption and refused to sanctify power simply because it wore the familiar garments of tradition and faith. As the decade turned and the scandal receded into something spoken of only in careful tones, the final shape of the story revealed itself not in verdicts or sermons, but in the quiet way the community learned to live with what it now knew, because the truth, once uncovered, does not depart neatly, but settles into the bones of a place, altering how people remember, how they teach their children, and how they interpret authority thereafter. The parish that had once revolved unquestioningly around the Thorntons became a patchwork of cautious relationships, where power was no longer assumed to be righteous simply because it appeared orderly, and this shift, though subtle, marked the most lasting consequence of Eleanor's intervention. Years later, scholars and clerks would occasionally request access to the preserved records, drawn by rumors of an unusually sophisticated conspiracy for such a small community, and each time the ledgers were opened, the same pattern emerged with unsettling clarity: not monsters acting alone, but ordinary men leveraging trust, ritual, and silence to create an ecosystem where wrongdoing could thrive unnoticed. Eleanor herself never returned, choosing instead a life defined by deliberate obscurity, moving between towns, assisting quietly with archival work and correspondence, her name appearing only rarely in marginal notes and private letters, and when asked directly about the parish, she refused grand statements, insisting that the story was never about heroism but about attention, about the simple act of refusing to look away when something felt wrong. In the parish, a generation grew up hearing fragments of the tale, often sanitized, sometimes distorted, but always tinged with unease, and it was among these younger residents that a different kind of vigilance took root, expressed through modest reforms, shared oversight of church finances, and an insistence on transparency that older members found uncomfortable, but could not openly oppose without invoking memories they preferred to forget. The Thorntons' former properties passed through several hands, none managing to restore the old aura of prestige, as if the land itself resisted reclamation. And visitors sometimes remarked on an indefinable heaviness that lingered around the abandoned rectory and adjacent fields, a sensation locals dismissed as superstition while privately acknowledging that places, like people, absorb the weight of what occurs within them. On anniversaries of the trials, small unmarked gatherings formed among descendants of those harmed, not to relive the pain publicly, but to affirm that the events would not be erased entirely. That memory, however imperfect, was an act of resistance against the comfort of forgetting. Over time, the parish learned to narrate its past more honestly, though never completely accepting that some wounds do not close, but instead teach the body how to move differently. And in this acceptance lay a quiet maturity that had been absent during the years of fear and false sanctity. Eleanor, in one of her last known letters, wrote that the most dangerous lie is the one that promises protection in exchange for obedience, because it trains people to mistake silence for virtue, and she warned that the structures that enable abuse rarely announce themselves as threats, arriving instead cloaked in familiarity and reverence, demanding only that questions remain unasked. That letter, copied and circulated privately after her death, became something of a moral touchstone for those who encountered it, not because it offered solutions, but because it articulated the responsibility of witnesses, the obligation to notice patterns before they calcify into tradition. In the end, the story of the Thornton family did not conclude with a dramatic moral triumph, but with a quieter, more unsettling truth that justice is often incomplete, memory fragile, and vigilance an ongoing labor, rather than a single courageous act. The parish endured, altered but not redeemed, carrying forward the knowledge that institutions, no matter how sacred they appear, are shaped by human choices and therefore vulnerable to human corruption, and that only sustained attention can prevent history from repeating itself under a different name. And if this story held you to the end, if it made you uneasy, reflective, or compelled you to look twice at the comforting narratives handed down without question, then take a moment now to subscribe to Born into Darkness. Hit the bell icon so you never miss these buried histories, and leave a comment telling me how deeply this story affected you, because these stories survive only when they are heard, remembered, and carried forward by those willing to confront the darkness rather than pretend it was never there.